Imagine believing that if the lock on the front door isn't checked for the 8th time in a row, a family member will die. Or that if a used fast food wrapper is thrown away, it may be needed 5 years into the future to prevent a financial catastrophe. This is the type of psychic world inhabited by those with obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD. The disorder is defined as an individual's false belief that he or she must engage in peculiar and sometimes self-destructive behaviors in order to prevent imaginary outcomes. OCD affects more than 5 million Americans and usually begins to emerge either in adolescence or early adulthood. In the 20th anniversary edition of Brainlock, research psychiatrist and author Jeffrey Schwartz explores some of the OCD case studies he undertook during his years at the UCLA School of Medicine, which led to the development of a 4-step cognitive behavioral therapy for OCD. The biochemical problem that manifests in patients with OCD can be alleviated with a simple yet rigorous series of 4 steps that essentially ask patients to separate their compulsive or obsessive thoughts from their personal identity. By learning how to distinguish an obsessive-compulsive thought from a healthy human, patients can begin to take control of previously bewildering or damaging mental patterns. This 4-step gradually leads to changes in behavior and brain chemistry, which subsequently alleviates symptoms and leads to a healthier, more balanced life. The therapy is rooted in the notion of mindful awareness and the creation of a more objective self. The applications of this cognitive behavioral therapy can extend to other conditions rooted in a lack of impulse control, such as substance abuse, gambling, and sex addiction, with certain caveats. Crucial, all those who have impulse control disorders must first be able to identify the underlying cause. For years, many of those with OCD were misdiagnosed, leading to unfounded institutionalization or misguided explanations for their behavior. A greater social awareness of this condition, coupled with the adoption of the time-tested 4-step method, helps thousands of people each year find the therapy they need to take back their brain and, by extension, their lives. OCD manifests in numerous forms, including hoarding, compulsive checking, and nonsensical beliefs. Richly detailed case studies of hoarders, checkers, those prone to constantly rechecking times, dials, or physical positions, and people obsessed with cleanliness and nonsensical thoughts reveal a mental landscape where ordinary actions take on ominous, sometimes socially crippling meaning. One man falsely believes his fingertips are embedded with razor blades, which makes him not want to touch his wife during lovemaking or handle delicate objects. Although this syndrome may seem to encompass delusional psychosis, the man's recurring nonsensical belief that his fingertips are embedded with razor blades, combined with his desire not to hurt others, has forced him to develop obsessive tendencies. A teenage boy showers for 8 to 10 hours at a time because each time he cleans a part of his body, he is convinced that drops from the shower dirty the section he has just washed, making him redo the entire operation. A woman believes that contact with the outside world results in contamination, prompting her to set up a household in which her 2 middle school-age daughters must come home, deposit their contaminated clothes in one closet, and then dress themselves in another closet filled with non-contaminated items. The daughters are not allowed to touch or hug their mother until they have first decontaminated themselves. This woman's untreated belief in contamination eventually alienates her from most of her family, including one of her daughters. OCD is related to a biochemical problem in the brain, specifically in the caudate nucleus and the putamen. Key messaging structures of the brain become chemically fused in people with OCD. The caudate nucleus and the putamen make up one of the primary signal processing centers of the brain. In healthy patients, the caudate nucleus and putamen work together to coordinate thought and movement during ordinary daily activities. In OCD patients, The ability of the caudate nucleus to process thoughts efficiently is hampered, resulting in repetitive thoughts or compulsions that often manifest as physical activities. The term brain lock refers to these chemically fused components. Much like a car's gear shift, in OCD patients, the two components or gears are essentially jammed up when they should be working together in order to help process thoughts, choose appropriate behaviors, and then move on to the next set of thoughts. Because their metaphorical gears are jammed, OCD patients will continue feeling compulsive urges, like the urge check that they shut off their stove for long after such activities are actually necessary. Practicing cognitive behavioral therapy can change the chemical makeup of the brain of an OCD patient. The chemical imbalance that often fuels OCD can gradually be changed with a 4-step method in which patients learn how to categorize their compulsive thoughts and resist performing the activities associated with them. This exposure and response prevention method is broken down into 4 stages, which are known as relabel, reattribute, refocus, and revalue. A man feeling the impulse to clean his apartment 13 times in a row must stop himself from doing so by clarifying that the urge is driven by his OCD, not by necessity. Gaining this foothold over compulsive thoughts is the first step of the 4-step process known as relabeling. After the thoughts have been correctly classified as being part of the disease, the next step is to reattribute those thoughts. This step can be compared to conceptualizing obsessive thoughts as a false alarm. The alarm may sound real, but it has absolutely no bearing on reality. Healthy people, while annoyed by the sound of the false alarm, will not attempt to will the alarm to cease. They instead try to distract themselves from the noise and resume whatever activity they were engaged in. Patients with OCD must learn not only to first relabel the alarm as a nuisance, but also to reattribute the problem by telling themselves that they will not react to the alarm, as it has no actual relevance to their life and is merely a faulty message from their brain. The third step, refocusing, requires the patient to substitute habitual compulsive behavior with an alternate, often pleasurable behavior. Instead of reacting to the brain signal that demands she wash her hands yet again, a woman with OCD should play a computer game for 15 minutes, or perhaps go outside and water some plants. The idea is to break the cycle of self-destructive response by refusing to engage in the harmful activity and substituting that activity with something positive. This action can gradually reformulate the chemistry of the brain, helping to dismantle or at least arrest the primary triggers of OCD. The fourth and final step, revalue, encourages positive reinforcement of healthy behaviors and an active categorization of harmful thoughts. During an attack, OCD patients should practice the first 3 steps and then assert to themselves that the thought is happening in spite of their will, not because of it. Revaluing problematic thoughts makes it easier in the future to recognize obsessive or compulsive impulses as essentially worthless. Patients who once washed their hands dozens of times a day or had to take an 8-hour shower each day gradually begin to understand that their condition does not have to control all of their actions and thoughts. The 4 steps enable the OCD patient to achieve mindful awareness, which is a crucial component of successful behavioral therapy. Although the behavioral treatment for OCD is divided into 4 distinct steps, the most vital component is the ability of patients to attain mindful awareness of themselves and their environments. Mindful awareness requires more than a simple acknowledgement of being present in a particular time or place, of their own mental status. Adopting the viewpoint of an impartial spectator allows those with the condition to be able to say to themselves, "It's not me, it's the OCD." While this therapy can be taken in conjunction with medication, it has been proven to work entirely on its own. Each OCD patient begins with what is termed an untrained mind. By regularly practicing the 4 steps, patients gradually train their minds to devalue and ignore compulsions. The patient's ability to recognize and reject compulsions, coupled with the subsequent performance of pleasurable behaviors, gradually results in a reduction of the brain lock that characterizes the physiological expression of OCD. Although stressful conditions can aggravate the faulty chemistry in the brain and produce some of the same compulsive urges or symptoms, patients who methodically integrate the mindfulness-based 4-step therapy into their daily practice will notice a significant reduction in unwanted thoughts. Key Insight 5. Obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, OCPD, differs from OCD in several important respects. OCPD is a far less disabling condition than OCD. OCPD describes behaviors that, while unpleasant, manifest less as compulsions and more as eccentricities. An OCD patient with a hoarding compulsion feels compelled to stuff every available surface at home with mostly useless items. A patient with OCPD may habitually retain only 1 or 2 useless items with the belief that they will be needed in the future. For example, a man who is a hoarder may keep every magazine, newspaper, or scrap of paper that enters his home because he is afraid that he will need to reference each of these items to ward off a disastrous outcome. A man with OCPD, however, may only hold on to 1 copy of an obscure magazine, believing that if he were to discard it. Frequently, those with OCPD suffer from a form of perfectionism that makes them rigid and uncompromising. They believe the only proper method of doing something and generally show no desire to change their behaviors. While OCD patients take no pleasure from their compulsions, individuals with OCPD enjoy their rituals and either are unaware that other people do not also enjoy those rituals or simply discount anyone else's feelings on the subject. Key Insight 6. Medication plays a specific yet limited role in helping OCD patients recognize and regulate their obsessions and compulsions. Approximately 50 to 66% of people with OCD may at first benefit from a combination of the 4 steps and a carefully prescribed dose of medication. The medication helps lower the intensity of symptoms as well as the fear that patients may experience as a result of their condition. Medication functions as a temporary anxiety-reducing measure to create the right level of calmness required for OCD patients to become mindful of their condition. As each patient masters the 4 steps, the medication dose can be gradually lowered or even stopped entirely. Family dynamics, combined with a poor understanding of the disease, can inadvertently prolong an OCD patient's illness. Families often become enablers of an OCD patient by assisting in repetitive tasks or indulging compulsive behaviors. Over a period of years, the family members' routines create power dynamics and interpersonal relationships that are designed to compensate for the illness. A wife whose husband repeatedly asks her if she went to the grocery store on her way home might decide to lie because she knows her husband is paranoid that she's become contaminated with germs and will insist that she take a shower before preparing dinner. Although she did in fact go to the grocery store, she tells him she did not go shopping in order to preserve a basic harmony within the household. By lying, she avoids conflict but is, unfortunately, enabling her husband's disease. In order for healthy people to truly help their family members, they must encourage OCD patients to identify their compulsive behaviors and try not to give in to those compulsions. To truly help her husband, the wife in the previous example must stop lying to him and instead encourage him to identify his concern about contamination as a symptom of his OCD with no significant consequence in reality. Ironically, when OCD patients do finally begin to control their behaviors, their newfound health can shed light on compensatory behaviors or other shortcomings within the family that reverse roles and upend power dynamics. Those who manage to successfully control their OCD may have to learn how to navigate an environment where they are a fully functioning member of a household and no longer an excuse for the family's failings. The 4-step treatment for OCD can be applied to treating other impulse control disorders. Those with OCD do not find their compulsions pleasurable. This is in stark contrast to people with impulse control conditions such as gambling, overeating, alcohol and drug abuse, or compulsive sexual behavior. The primary urge in these cases is very similar across afflictions in its seeming undeniable power. However, an alcoholic is likely to find some pleasure in drinking, whereas OCD patients take no joy from checking that their basement door is locked the 7th time. Applying the 4 principal steps to managing OCD, relabel, reattribute, refocus, and revalue, to a condition such as overeating is therefore useful only if the affected individual is willing to perform additional mental and emotional labor. An alcoholic who wishes to relabel the urge to consume must also be willing to give up the pleasure inherent in the act of imbibing. Unlike an OCD patient, the alcoholic must relabel not only the initial harmful impulse, but also the pleasure taken in the excessive act. Important people.